Thank you for those kind words. I don't have any Stepsons or not the line dancing, so I don't have the same skeletons in the closet, sorry. For those of you unsure about the world geography, I thought I'd give you a bit of an introduction. New Zealand is located at the top of the world, so just clearing up that confusion straight away. We are a very diverse race. This is a recent family photograph. I took the photo, all good friends of mine. This is my driveway, how I get to work in the morning. It's a great commute. But in all seriousness, people in UK often get confused between Canterbury and Christchurch. So this is a region called Canterbury, and Christchurch sits sort of slap bang in the middle here. Now, it's administered by an organisation called the Canterbury District Health Board, or the CDHB, and you can see some of the numbers we're dealing with here. So we say 9,000 direct employees, and then 9,000 indirect. So that's pharmacists, GPs, etc., who are funded by the organisation. Now, I'm going to talk about the journey from when we started this transformation program in 2007. And one of the things that's really important to consider about this is when you're dealing with large complex issues and transformation, it's never easy to see the way forward. So what we did from 2007 and how we planned it and how we thought it would have gone looked very differently to how it looks in hindsight. So in hindsight, it looks like this. So if you think about the different strands needed to pull this program together, they're on the left-hand side, and along the way we had a whole range of programs in which I'll talk about today. But looking back, this seems like a very logical, straightforward way of doing it. Going from here forward, it was very, very iterative, lots and lots of rewrites and considerations about how to make this work, and a few mistakes along the way. So I think you need to bear this in mind, that there is no one hard and fast way of doing this. There are mistakes along the way, you need to iterate, and you will have failures on this path of transformation, but you need to tolerate those and also have an appetite for risk. Now, way back in 2007, the health system in Canterbury was in a very different state to where it is now, and there was quite a significant need to make things change. So typically how the health system would vent its frustration about some of the problems in the system was by going to the media. And these are some of the headlines drawn from the media at the time. Typically what would happen would be clinicians would bypass the normal routes to venting frustration through management or through their governance structures and go straight to the media. So on the front page you would see headlines like this, and they were pretty horrible. You would see editorials lambasting the system, you'd see all sorts of horror stories coming out. And that was pretty standard. So the starting place was a system in crisis, lack of trust, no real joined up view of how to go forward. Also, what happened was that there was a recognition that Canterbury had an ageing population, and it was ageing faster than the rest of the country, and it was likely to mean that in the next 10, 15 years you would have a situation of having this for care staff, and there was recognition that if you carried on doing things the same way, you would need to build another hospital the size of the current hospital and then staff it as well. So with an ageing population, a retiring workforce, it simply wasn't possible to have the workforce to staff this hospital, let alone the money to build it in the first place. So very definitely a system in crisis. Now, what we did first of all is we set out to define a vision of where the system should go. And this is really important starting point, is that it's very difficult to enact change by what I call the hand of God theory, which is you shall change. Right? Never works in any sectors I've come across. I work in public and private sectors. The track record of chief execs and boards telling people to change is pretty woeful. In fact, there are probably very few, if any, examples where that's actually worked successfully. What we did was quite different. So we pulled together a group of people we called the 80, 2 workshops of 40. It's a pretty imaginative name, as you'll see. We got better as we went on with the naming situation. But we were aiming to define what the health system would look like in 2020. So we called it Seeing 2020. And what we did was bring together thought leaders and influencers, not necessarily hierarchical leaders, from right across the system. And we brought them together for a series of 3-day workshops. This is the then Chief Exec, Gordon Davies, in the top left-hand corner, who started this whole program off. He was a caretaker Chief Exec. He'd been in the health system all his life. He had a 3-year window before he retired, and he decided that there was a need to make change happen, and he was the guy to do it. Very little risk involved for him. So what we did, we pulled together these groups of people. We had a couple of workshops. This is the second workshop. The new incoming Chief Exec, David Mates, is sitting up there. He has a look on his face like I'm not quite sure what's going on, but I think it's pretty good. I'll cover that a bit later on. So we pulled these people together in these workshops, and what we did was a process of smashing paradigms. And this is really, really important, because often what you find in any sector or any industry, there is a tendency just to look solely at your industry or sector for the answers to problems that you face. So I'm a big fan of this process called idea arbitrage. So looking across industries and sectors to find answers to problems which are similar to the ones that you have. So in these 3-day workshops, for example, we pulled in insights from airlines. This is a lady from Air New Zealand. Air New Zealand has won the IATA Airline of the Year award now for about 4 years in a row. That's a plug for my national airline, by the way. It's very, very good. But they have quality and safety processes going all the way through their system, from the time you go online and book a seat to the time you get off. And what's not known is how these systems work, and they're pretty much invisible to flyers, but they're absolutely critical to making sure planes don't fall out of the sky at random. So Air New Zealand's safety record is exemplary. And what she talked about was all the things that the airline does in the background to ensure quality and safety. Now what's important with these speakers also is I brought them in and said, don't talk about health. Don't mention anything about health. We want people to make parallels and draw their own conclusions about some of the things you're talking about, understand how they can apply them into the healthcare system. This is the then Chief Demographer from the Department of Stats in New Zealand, talking about the ageing situation and really bringing home the fact that the population in Canterbury was ageing faster than anywhere else in the country, that this would create a double whammy. So you have increased demand on the workforce, plus you have a decreased workforce from an ageing population. This gentleman here is from an advertising agency. I brought him in to talk about how you communicate complex messages, how advertisers pay agencies to think very, very carefully about key messages to ensure alignment, to produce branding campaigns and run advertising campaigns. We also brought in this guy here. So he was the food and beverage manager from a hotel in Christchurch, which has won a Condé Nast Gold Award year after year. It's one of the small luxury hotels in the world. Once again, I said to him, don't talk about healthcare, talk about how you provide great customer service. So he told the story of how they give the gardener the same training as the general manager. And the rationale behind that was when guests leave the hotel and they walk out, the gardener could be the last person they see before they leave the hotel. And they'll often say to the gardener, it's a nice day, where should I go today? And so they gave the gardener the same customer training. This is a lady talking about how they revitalised the bus system in Christchurch. So at one point, the local council had a decision whether to scrap the bus system completely because it was losing money, or to actually double down and innovate seriously to rethink how buses should be provided to Christchurch. What resulted from her work was that the Canterbury bus system was subsequently developed into one of the best in the world, and cities from around the world came to look at how Canterbury and Christchurch provided bus systems. One of the first in the world to provide GPS tracking on buses, one of the first in the world to provide apps so you can tell when the bus was actually going to arrive rather than supposed to arrive. Now what was interesting about all of these speakers and the idea of idea arbitrage is that you want people to draw their own conclusions. You want them to go through and see the parallels and the similarities and actually pull out these threads and learn how to apply some of those solutions and that thinking to their own setting. Telling smart people what to do is never very successful. Guiding them, letting them make their own conclusions and developing it is much, much smarter way of doing it. So over 3 days we brought people together to understand that there are ways of solving problems that might not necessarily exist in healthcare, but exist in other sectors. Subsequent to this, and I'll talk about it later on, some of these individuals and some of those organisations have become central to training large numbers of health workforce employees and thinking differently about how they approach problems that seemingly intractable, but solutions are found elsewhere. The other thing that was fascinating about this process over 3 days is we noticed that towards the end of day 2, there was like this head of steam. People were really, really enthusiastic about having the knowledge and tools to go out and make change happen. But we had no mechanism by which we could actually tell them to do that. So on the fly, we got the graphical recorder who was helping us on the day to create these. We called these permission cards. This is actually not a life-size one, they're actually wallet size. But the wallet size and laminated, and we got Gordon Davies to sign them. And as each individual left the workshop, Gordon shook their hand and said, "You have my permission to make change happen." And the effect was quite traumatic. One woman actually broke down and cried when she got one of these. 6 months after, Gordon was actually at a rural hospital, and a charge nurse came rushing up to him and said, "I changed this and did this, and it was better for patients, and it cost us nothing." And she pulled the permission card out and said, "You told me I could." And Gordon sat there and went, But it virtually cost nothing. It made a significant change in patient outcomes, but it was because she felt she had permission to do so. It was a really interesting effect. Now, subsequent to this, we had the challenge that if we had 80 people really enthused and they designed this vision for where the system should go and design it from the bottom up, then we have a governance challenge because we need to get the whole system to understand the nature of this change. So what we did is we took the board of the CDHB through a similar process but compressed it into 4 hours. And the rationale behind that was the CDHB is both a planner and a funder, and so they control that 1.4 billion New Zealand dollars that goes into the health system. We need to ensure that when Gordon left, the direction of travel was endorsed by the board. So we brought the board together to run them through some scenarios. So we brought in clinicians to talk about how the system should change. We ran interactive sessions. We broke the board into different groups. We ran these interactive experiences for them. We talked about scenarios. So we designed scenarios about the changed versus the unchanged system, how things might go forward for different slots and times. So this was from 2009 going forward to 2014. We looked at care pathways. We looked at summaries of care. We actually put some rough numbers against it, so the board had a sort of like a test to understand what the fundamental difference would be. What was fascinating about this, at the end of that day, it was actually on a Saturday we pulled them all together, we had a very contentious board at the time. And we actually had one person there who was known to be a troublemaker, and we were really sort of holding our breath as to where things would go. At the end of this full-day session running through this process, he said, "This is the first time as a board we've all ever agreed on one thing." So the effect about taking groups of people out of their comfort zones, walking them through experiences in such a way that involves them in depth and gives them thinking time is really, really important. Because often what people do is say, "We're going to do a strategy," and they do it in 3 hours. Never works. You end up in the same place you've always been. You need to think about how you do that stuff and think about how you do it well and invest in that process. Now, the other thing we looked at was how you get people to understand that some of the problems they're facing can be viewed through a different lens. And there are some key messages that we used. So, first of all, there was widespread recognition that the system was financially unsustainable. And the answer to that was to think about how the money is distributed through the system. And essentially, the tap that used to be there that sort of dropped money out of the sky into this big bucket was being turned off as governments come under financial pressure. So we said actually to think about one bucket of money across one system. So how do you best spend that dollar across the system rather than thinking about how do you chop it up and spend it in different silos through contractual arrangements? And the key to that really is not so much focusing on money, but focusing on patient time. So what you find is that people work in healthcare to make a difference to patient outcomes. They don't work in healthcare to manage budgets. And what we said was actually put the patient at the centre and think about how you save patient time, and out of that you will save money. But actually, patient time is the metric you should be using at the outset, not money. What's fascinating about this approach is that we've actually had charge nurses from NHS hospitals actually come and work in Canterbury and apply for jobs because they got sick of being told that one of their KPIs was to cut X million pounds out of their budget. They actually wanted to do stuff for patients, and they understood how to manage for patient time. And when you actually think about managing patient time, you do save money at the end of it. But it's not one of the incentives and one of the motivations that drives them to work in health. So the trick then was, if we had 80 people who were all lined up and the board was lined up and the chief exec was lined up, then how do you actually start to go from 80 out to thousands and thousands of people? And the analogy I like to use here is that if you think about iron filings, and if you have a handful of iron filings and you throw them on a table, they go different directions. But if you get a magnet and wave it across the top, they all line up. And really what you want is some sort of alignment at mass to make sure that everyone understands the direction of travel. So when you do that, things start to change. Otherwise you have a situation of herding cats, and you don't want that. So our solution was to think about how we could take that experience that had taken 3 days to create an architect and compress that into something that was scalable, so we could get a few more people through this to get to understand direction of travel. We came up with a concept called Showcase, which was a mix of a corporate roadshow brought to life, a vision document, and the best interactive museum you've ever been to see. Now what we did was we said to each of those 80 people, invite some friends and colleagues along, trust us with your time and your reputation, and we will create an experience that brings to life what you designed as a vision for the system. So we took over a disused warehouse. It had actually been set up as an emergency flu treatment centre. We had a few constraints about the space. People walked in, they really had no idea what they were coming into, but friends and colleagues had told them that they should come along to this thing and they should trust them. So they came in groups of 10, and when they sat down in the first area, we had a few things ready for them. So we had a visitor's book they signed into. We had pictures running through of how the system used to be. What was interesting about this was that the photo show started in the 1900s when the first hospital was built and went all the way through the 60s and 70s. And there were people working in health who actually looked at the picture and said, oh look, there's so-and-so and so-and-so. So people working in healthcare do it for a very long time, and they understand how changes have happened along the way. These chairs, for example, we salvaged those from a nursing home that had been demolished. People recognised the chairs when they sat down. We put these suitcases in the corner, we put labels on them like, that's not my job, we've always done it that way, and I'm not contracted to do that. And we said, when you go into Showcase, leave your baggage behind. And some people sat down, looked at the suitcases, and one guy actually started laughing. And he said, never believe it, but an hour before I came here, someone used that exact phrase in a meeting. That's not my job. So these are all the phrases that people use to block change, and we stuck them on the baggage and told them to leave it behind. When they came into Showcase, they really had no idea what they were coming into. The first bit they came into was this setup where people sit in Zimmer frames to highlight the ageing population. We set this room up to be like hospitals used to be, so we found this horrible hospital brown lino and this horrible institutional green. We found these old privacy curtains which we stuck up there as well. This ghostly image here is a video recording of David Mate, the chief exec, talking about why they're at Showcase and some of the challenges facing the health systems, an ageing population, reduced budget, etc. It was very difficult to get David there the whole time, obviously, so we had this video of him on the wall. When he finished his talk, he said, so now I want you to push the wall and come on through. And people sort of sat there and went, what does he mean? And we said, well, it's interactive, so you need to push the wall. So they pushed the wall and went through the next section of Showcase. And all the way through, we created this experience which constantly surprised people and said, we value your time. The next bit we did was case studies from health systems around the world that have successfully made change happen. Now, this is really important because often people in health think the system is so complex and so fiendishly difficult, change can't happen. So we went around the world and did some research and found examples of particular areas where change had happened successfully, and we had case studies that people read. Then we said, so if you can make change happen, how would it look like and what would happen? So we did scenarios once again for 2011, 2014, 2017 for a couple of care pathways, did it for an ageing population and also one for respiratory illness. And we got people to work through what it would look like if nothing changed and what it would look like if you actually managed to change the system. And the idea behind this was often people think that to make change happen, they have to do this massive, big, explosion of activity and it will change at the end point. They actually don't realise you need to make small incremental changes on the way. And so we highlighted that if you start making change today, you actually get to an end point. But if you don't, the changes get so big, the time it actually to change is too difficult. It's a fundamental problem people have with change. They can't understand the time frames and some of the things that need to happen on the way. So for 2020 as an endpoint, we actually mocked up what it might look like from a patient point of view. So we built this sort of lounge area and we recorded a mock call between a patient and a nurse. You can see it's quite an elderly patient. What was interesting here is some people went into this room and they said, well, that would never happen. She's in her 80s and she'd never use Skype and that's just ridiculous. And we said, well, actually, she is about 82 and she does use Skype because her grandchildren live in a different city and she Skypes them every week. So everything we did in Showcase, you had to peel back to something that was actually real and authentic. Even though we sort of built these mock environments, everything had to be genuine. Now, what was fascinating about this is an actual nurse and an expert patient, and we gave them the brief to say, how would your care as an elderly person with respiratory illness look like in 2020? And they ad-libbed. They should have got an Oscar for it, because each of them knew exactly what should happen and how systems should change. They did this mock call, sort of face-to-face with your video, talking about how things should go. So we split groups into two. One of them we showed it from the patient point of view. The other one we showed from the clinic point of view. So the idea was this was the nurse on the other end of the call. Because we had this constraint around the space we used, we actually had this emergency flu centre being set up to deal with swine flu. So there was constraints around the space we used. So we had this maze of plywood treatment rooms and things to use. So for this one we had a real constraint and we had to make this small room into a doctor's waiting room or a nurse's waiting room. So we actually went out and photographed a GP room. We printed it out wallpaper size. We made a curved wall. We stuck it on the wall. We cut the screen out and put a real screen there. And we put a few plants in there and things. And the effect was so compelling that one person went in, took a quick glance and went to put his papers on the table and actually punched his head into the wall. And I went, success, it worked. That's great. Right, so these sort of things give people an experience they would never normally have. And say, once again, we value your time. We're actually going to treat you with some sort of respect around how we want you to learn. The other thing we did was we set out how things might look like in a system. Because the use of the word system wasn't very widespread at the time. People didn't understand they worked in a system that was complex and evolving. Generally, they saw only parts of their own system, so the siloed thinking. So we got this guy here who was a leader of the GP system at the time, one of the local chairs, and we videoed him. He talked about how the system was changing, and we had some graphical recordings put on the wall to talk about how healthcare was a system and a complex system, some of the facets of system thinking and how they need to change, and he talked through the charts one by one. We did a bit of a whiteboard exercise where we pulled people out and said, so given what you've heard so far, what do you think this means for how your job might change? And we've got some really fascinating responses here. So I remember quite clearly one guy actually doing virtually one of these entire panels with this fascinating diagram of how the system should change. And just a week before, the HBR had done this piece about healthcare transformation in the States. And I said to him, is that from the HBR article last week? He goes, no, it just makes sense. So we photographed this and sent it around people. And this way you could find people who were thinking about system transformation and start to enroll them in the process as well. What we also found in this is though, people tend to default to thinking that individuals can't make change happen. So they always think that someone else will start it or they will start making change happen. So what we did, we deliberately set out to find examples of individuals who had successfully made large-scale change happen despite all the barriers that generally stopped it. So we showcased each of those individuals, and then we built these environments to tell their story. People like to learn in different ways, so what we did was we videoed the story of the person telling the story themselves. This is about a nurse who had changed the training program for how IV fluids are administered, and she changed it not for just her area but all the hospitals in the region. We did things like these IV bags, for example. We printed the story on custom-made IV bags. So we actually made IV bags about that high off the floor and printed on them black and white and filled them with fluid, because we recognise that people learn in different ways. So some people don't want to hear the story, they want to see the writing. We had to make it engaging enough for them to actually want and stop and read the story. And even now, years later, I can go back to people and ask them, did they go through the IV story, and they'll tell me about the giant IV bags and the story was written on it. Right, so we want the stuff to stick and to resonate. What we also did was look at other stories, and what I at the time found fascinating was that you tend to think that surgeons, for example, are at the top of the pyramid, and that they can do anything they want to and they can make change happen. We had a story of a surgeon who changed how gallbladder surgery was performed. I won't go into details, but basically it's a before and after story. Before, lots of mazes and stops and starts. Afterwards, quite a smooth journey. So we actually talked about, you can see on the side, it's this flow chart of how things used to be. We had the surgeon telling the story on the screen, that didn't come out so well in the photograph. To illustrate the before and after story, when he finished the video, we said, so now push the bed through the wall. People said, excuse me? And we said, it's interactive, right? So push the bed through the wall. So they pushed the bed through the wall, and there was the example of the news story set up there. And what we also had was a mock-up of a keyhole surgery. So we had a keyhole tower set up. I didn't realise at the time how much those towers were worth. It was actually about $750,000 of kit we had sitting there in the showcase, which is quite fascinating. And we had the new flow chart of how things were performed. We had the story of the surgeon telling how things were different now and how it sped it up from a patient point of view and reduced the amount of time the patient was in the system, and all these benefits around cost savings, etc., etc., etc. So I really bring those stories to life. We told a story also about how a healthy lifestyle eating program form had been developed and how it was given out in GP treatment rooms. This is sort of like a mock-up of a treatment room, and there was a video projection of the woman who did the story, and we actually ran participants through some of the materials that we used in that program. You know, things like how many calories in this food versus that food, you know, how much calories does this exercise take versus that exercise. That was fascinating in itself, some of those responses. There was a story about how skin lesions were treated. I'll tell you some more detail later on, but essentially that was once again, lots of mazes and stops in the system. So we put lots of mazes and stops in the showcase, and then we told people what it was like afterwards and how it would change, because there's a process called health pathways, which I will touch on as well later. But really it boiled down to these three questions at the end we asked people, which essentially is the granny test on steroids. And so the granny test is, if your grandmother was in hospital, how would you want her to be treated, and how would that care be administered? But the second part of that is, who else do you start to bring into that care? You know, which phone calls do you make because you know somebody? You know, which favours can you call in to give them better care? And then the third most important question is, if you weren't present in the system, would that same level of care be delivered? So how do you make that systematic across the system, whether you're there or not? And then the really important question we asked people was this, right? What's the role you play in making things better? And that actually stopped people in their tracks, because once again, people sort of think, well, that's, you know, I do this, but actually, you know, change happens somewhere else. We sat people down afterwards and gave them a debrief. And in that debrief, we asked them, you know, what do you think this means for the health system and how you work? We had a graphical recorder, you can see them in the background talking about how they were recording the conversation, because each group that came through, we had no idea who was going to be in there. So there was a host that invited another group of 9 into their group. We had no idea who they were going to be, what sort of conversations they had. That surgeon that changed the gallbladder pathway, he decided his group would have a couple of his colleagues who were surgeons, a couple of nurses, a receptionist, a cleaner, and a GP. Because he wanted a cross-system view of how care should be delivered. So he brought that group through. We never had any idea, we had no control of who came through. The conversations we captured, the original was about this size, and we gave A3 copies to everybody who went through Showcase. We recorded all the conversations in this way, so we have a record of every single conversation that happened in Showcase. We didn't tell people what to do with those artifacts afterwards, but what happened was fascinating. So they started going up all around the health system of their own volition. So people started sticking them on walls. This is a full-size one in the corridor at the labs. There's some more on notice boards. When I was taking these photos about a couple of weeks into Showcase, what I would do is literally walk around different places in the health system, stop a random stranger and say, "Did you go to Showcase? And where's your takeaway?" And they'd point me to notice boards. Let's go and take photos. So these things started conversations all across the health system, because everyone had their own conversation. They wanted to share what was going on, what they said. And no two of these were the same. At the end of Showcase, we also said to people two things. So if you liked Showcase, give us your thoughts. And if you wanted to bring other people through, we'll make it possible for you to host your own group. And you can come back through as a host for that. So it's sort of word of mouth stuff. We said to people, let us know what you thought of it. We gave them Sharpies and Post-it notes. We ran out of room on the walls to capture all the feedback. We didn't have a wide angle lens that was wide enough to capture it. You can see some of it there. A sort of close-up of some of the feedback that we got, which is indicative of most of it, was this. So I sort of like these ones here. Change is possible. And finally a journey we want to take, and the map seems clearer. So think back to that idea about the iron filings on the table and lining it all up. This was a process by which we get people to understand the direction of travel in a lined up fashion. And the feedback we got was in line with what we wanted to achieve. So Showcase was a method by which we could scale it. The only way to get to Showcase was if someone asked you to come along. There was no CEO invitation, there was no media coverage, no memos, nothing. The only way to get there was if someone who you knew and trusted said, take some time out of your day, come to this thing, it's really interesting. So we thought that a measure of success would be that from those 80 people, if they each invited 10 people, we'd get 800, 50% hit rate, get 400 through. We knew each group took 2 hours, might run it for a week and a half, job done, success. Turns out we were pretty naive, and word of mouth is much more powerful than we thought. So it had to run for 6 weeks. In the end, we got 2,000 people through. The only reason we had to stop it was because the lease ran out. So we had a short period of time to run it, and basically we could have kept on going until we blew through a few more thousand people. But it was extraordinary. People started travelling like 4 or 5 hours from around the country to come to Showcase. People flew in to come to Showcase. One lady got on a motorbike from a little remote part of New Zealand on the west coast in the south, and she rode 6 hours to get to an 8 a.m. session to go through Showcase. All through word of mouth. Right? People understanding that there was something different going on, they want to be part of it, understand how the change journey would happen. The challenge though is that people came out of Showcase and they're all excited and fired up, and you didn't want to send them back to the system just to face this brick wall again and go back into the same old. So we specifically set up training programs and systems people could sign up to at the end of Showcase as well, so that what they could do was start to make change happen. So we had a process by which projects in particular could be done, and we would give people the tools by which they understood how to make effective change happen. So we had this program we called Accelerate, which we subtitled The Business of Caring, which is all around how do you train people to actually understand some ideas around lean production, some of the Toyota lean thinking. So you start to systematically cut waste out of the system by focusing on patients. There were programs within Accelerate called things like Seeing for the First Time, where you would take people from different parts of the health system and sit them down in waiting rooms and do sort of like a design-centered approach and get them to watch people in waiting rooms and just map where they went and how long it took. And this is eye-opening for some people because it's always on the other side of the glass and never actually typically told what to do to track people. And so this whole way of opening their eyes up and saying, you know, that person's been sitting here for 2 hours, someone came out, talked to them, went back in again, they're still sitting for 2 hours, when they went back in, sat in a different chair, waited another hour to go to a different spot. This sort of stuff started to come out. And it's really, really important to give people tools by which to make change happen. So once again, learning from industries you'd never normally think to look at, so Toyota's production system and lean thinking gave people ways of starting to think about how they could design projects and actually effectively make change happen. So this is the sort of the wheel that's been used for Accelerate, and it starts to talk about some of the things that you can do to make change happen. One of the really big things down here is removing variation. So variation in the system consumes huge amounts of patient time and huge amounts of money, because you think about 5 different clinicians seeing 5 different patients with a similar problem, you're likely, the transformation story, that have 5 completely different journeys through the system. One of them might be best practice, one of them might take 3 times as long as the other. So stripping out all the variation and actually implementing best practice is one of the things that's taught through the Accelerate program. At the end of the Accelerate program, each of the groups gets to spend time with the chief exec, David Mates, in a program called David's Den, ripped shamelessly from Dragon's Den, the same alliteration in fact, and they get to pitch their idea directly to the chief exec for a small pot of funding to make their program live. Alongside this, another program called Collaborate. You can start to see some branding similarities now. Collaborate is a 2-day leadership course. Talks about actually how you become a leader, how you actually start to make change happen. Covers a whole bunch of stuff, sort of runs alongside the Accelerate program, but aimed at a different level. Accelerate is aimed at senior and middle managers. This is open to anybody from across the system. When we were designing these programs, what was interesting was we weren't quite sure how they would be received. And a colleague of mine did the first session for Collaborate. We spent a lot of time designing it and iterating it. Ran the first test one. At the end of it, the 25 people or so in the program all left. And there was one lady left in a chair in the middle of the room. And my colleague Felicity was very worried, and we had a chat and said, you know, are you okay? Is everything fine? You haven't left? And this was her response. And that's what we want to try and create across the system, this energising initiative and impetus to actually make change happen through empowering people at the front line and giving them permission to make change happen. Because one person said after going through Showcase, I think the key message is David can't do it by himself, he needs my help. And I thought that's just perfect, right? Job done. But then how do you actually equip people to make that change happen? So one of the very key things about how you do that alignment is the scaling of that message, and how do you communicate a vision across thousands of people in different parts of the system. And so the one that Canterbury settled on is actually ripped off some work that was done, you might have recognised in the UK, I forget the originator of it, but it's been modified, and really what it comes down to is how do you put people at the centre of the system, not hospitals, not clinicians. And so now this is the vision for the Canterbury DHB and for the Canterbury Health System. And this diagram in different versions appears all the way across the Canterbury Health System. People refer to that as actually how care should be delivered. So effectively having people in the centre, community care wrapped around people's homes, but fast tracks out to various specialist care areas as required. And so we didn't actually have this documented in reams and reams of A4, but this encapsulates what the system is trying to get to in the direction of travel. A lot of it comes down to this: how do we get the right care from the right people in the right place at the right time? That's been a mantra that's pretty much been around since 2007, 2008, and it's the mantra people use again and again. One of the other things we also did was develop persona around an elderly patient. We called it Agnes, and the very first showcase we called that patient in the one I showed you with the nurse, we called it Agnes. And what's happened now is that people still say, how would this care be delivered for Agnes? What would this mean for Agnes? So having a persona that people can use as a touchstone to check their thinking against is also very, very important. An example, very practically, of what this has meant is around skin lesion treatment. So what used to happen pre-sort of transformation, pre-2007, was, from my point of view, quite staggering. So if you had a skin lesion, you would go see a GP. The GP would look at it and go, yep, that needs to be looked at. We'll put you on a waiting list to see a plastic surgeon. So they go on a waiting list, they go see the plastic. The plastic would say, yep, the GP was right. I'll put you on a waiting list to get that taken care of. Go on the waiting list, wait. They go see another plastic and get it taken out. So there's this sort of initiative going on where the key mantra now is how do you make it better by Monday? So clinicians involved in a particular care pathway such as skin lesions will get together and actually look at the whole system end to end from a patient point of view. And in skin lesions, they decided it was ridiculous how it was set up because it would take sometimes 8 months from the time a person went to see a GP to the time they actually got taken out by a plastic. And in that time, what could happen was the skin lesion gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the surgery gets more complicated, so it's a worse outcome for the patient, takes more time, and also takes more money for the plastic surgeon, etc. So what they did, they said what we should do is actually upskill GPs so they can get specialist tuition from plastic surgeons, so they can learn how to take out lesions and more lesions than they do now and feel more confident to do that. And then we should take out that second step. So if our GPs have been upskilled, they're really confident enough to make appropriate referrals, and we should just try and remove them on the spot rather than have 2 waiting lists. So what happened was that the process for getting a skin lesion removed went down from 8 months in some cases to 8 days. But the key thing is, how do you scale that? Right? So if you have this really good best practice case study, how do you scale that? And what's been used in Canterbury very effectively is this thing called pathways. So a GP can go online. All GPs have access to pathways. Now there are, so you can see the complete list down the side, but there are hundreds and hundreds of pathways for particular conditions. And now when you go to a GP, the first thing they do after examining you is go onto pathways and they look at the best practice for that particular pathway, and they use the flowchart to decide how care should be developed. So removing variation in the system and giving GPs the confidence they're doing the right thing every time. So this is a tool that's actually in use in some places in the UK, but the interesting thing about this is the tool is only as effective as what goes behind it. So actually having people working together, understanding the direction of travel, is almost more important than having the tool, but the tool gives you the scalability, right? So the ability to scale out the wisdom of 4 or 5 people right across the system is really important. So I went to my GP about 3 months ago. I've got access to pathways, so I knew what the answer was going to be before I got there. So I sat down and had a chat to him, and he said, oh, we should do this, this, and this. And I said, using pathways. He said, damn right I am. He said, using that, my daily routine has changed completely out of sight from what it was 10 years ago. Right? Because this best practice, all the complex stuff gets put in the right place, GPs get upskilled, GP nurses get trained to deal with more and more difficult things than they did before, using the right people at the right place at the right time. So what's interesting is some of the numbers that sit behind this. So in only 4 key areas, the DHB stripped out 1.5 million days of patient time in the first 4 years of taking this approach. And what's important is no one really ever talks about how much money they saved unless you're talking at a governance level or a ministry level. We all talk about how many days have been saved. People can relate to that, but it's important for patients, stripping out patient waiting time. Other important stats, so elderly people attending ED, on the far left is 2007, the far right is 2014. There are numbers and numbers and charts and graphs that start to reinforce this. One of the problems that we had in the first 2 or 3 years, people say, how do you know it's working? I got asked that. I did a presentation at the B&J conference, the annual one they have. I got invited to talk about this in Amsterdam a few years ago. So I was just got the bit where someone did a Q&A and someone said, how do you know it's working? And before I could answer, this woman in the audience leapt up and said, I'll answer that. And I went, oh my God. And someone grabbed a mic and she goes, I'm actually Dutch, I'm here visiting my parents, I worked in the Canterbury DHB, I do this, this and this for the last 5 years, and it's out of sight how things have changed and it's amazing. I was on stage going, oh my God. And they sat down and said, that's it. Everyone sort of went, including me. But in the first few years, it was really difficult to actually quantify. But now you can start to see these numbers. So people in the planning and funding function of the CDHB can just bore you for hours with charts like this that show direction and travel backed by hard data. The other thing that's interesting, from a financial sustainability point of view, the Auditor General came around public bodies in New Zealand and said that CDHB was now in the top 4% of all entities public across New Zealand for financial viability, sustainability and management. So that comes about by putting patients at the centre and valuing patient time rather than focusing on money. What you have in healthcare is a really unique situation, I think. So I work in public and private sector, a whole range of different industries, financial services, telecoms, infrastructure. And if I went to a chief exec in a private sector and said, I'll tell you how much money you're getting in the next 5 years, and I'll tell you how much demand, what you have to actually meet with that budget. And by the way, most people that work for you do so because they're intrinsically motivated. They'd fall out of their chair laughing and they would slay the market. In healthcare, people wring their hands. Oh, it's intractable, it's complex, you know. In the private sector, you would just kill that market. Really bad analogy used for healthcare, killing the market, but you know what I mean. So, key lessons coming out of this. The most important thing is an appetite for risk and a tolerance for risk. So Gordon Davies, the first chief exec that we dealt with, I spent literally days and days briefing him about the process we were going through to break paradigms, to reframe things, to build this vision. And the comment the day before he started this process, I said to him, so how are you feeling, Gordon? He said, I'm approaching this with equal amounts of terror and excitement. It's probably a good place to be. And then in the debrief immediately after that 3-day program, I said, how are you feeling? And this was his response. I had no idea what you're talking about, but I thought it was worth the risk. What was interesting was when I was talking to the next chief exec about doing Showcase, David Mates, I was talking about mixing up social movement theory and bringing corporate roadshows to life and interactive museums and a whole bunch of stuff. And he was smiling and nodding, but I could see in his eyes he had no idea what I was talking about. And after about 4 or 5 days running Showcase, it became apparent where it was going and the success. He just dropped it out of the blue, pulled me to one side and said, Roger, I had no idea what you're talking about, thought it was worth the risk. He almost said word for word what Gordon said. Right, so tolerance for risk. The other thing is this, right, people completely neglect to understand that you need to tell the narrative in the right way. And people think that this sort of stuff is going to make change happen, right? Especially underlining the important bits and setting it out in black and white across the system. That's going to make change happen every time, right? So you need to have the narrative right. And the reason we spent so much time creating these experiences with people is we said we want to value your time. You're smart people, you understand, you need to have some way of actually forming and having that vision aligned across the system. So the really important thing is giving people the space and time to think, valuing their time and reframing stuff. So I can go back now to people in the system who attended those first workshops in 2007 and they will tell me some of those key lessons they learned. And they'll say things like, wasn't it lucky we heard from the guy talking about the so-and-so and so-and-so? In my head I'm going, wasn't lucky. I'm going, yeah, it's great, wasn't it? But they'll know those lessons and they'll recall them from 9 years ago. The other thing is that we explicitly recognised that at the outset, governments love to meddle and they love to change the pieces of the puzzle. And we said that people working in healthcare will be there for a very long time and they will outlast the structures that governments like to impose. So we said the branding for this will not be linked to any other brands in the system, it's under our own brand. And we said it's our health system. So the other thing about healthcare is that everyone working in healthcare will eventually use the services. It's much a given, right? Whether you've got young children, elderly relatives, you go to hospital yourself, you will use the system you work in. Another really good lever. So it's actually your health system you should be thinking about. So what we did, we had these 2 brands, and people work in health to do this, to make it better. So these are the 2 brands that go all across the health system now. There's nothing that says CDHB in any of the large-scale transformation work that we do. We put this brand out. We never told people to use it. People started asking for the graphic for the signatures. They started asking for the high res. They could print it out in big format on the walls. They started sticking up all over the place. So the two brands that run the system, Our Health System and Make It Better, these brands will survive any organisational name changes. So the key thing is that it's one system and one bucket of money, and you're valuing patients' time, and that you need to have some common way of getting people to understand the direction of travel, and that is centred around people at the heart of the system. Now, this is the part of the program where I get to pause, take a breath, have a drink of water, and you get to ask me very difficult questions. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, I think.
You have about 15 minutes for questions. Roger, thank you very much indeed. That was inspiring again, and even more inspiring than just reading it in paper. So, the floor is now yours. I am pleased to say that we have now been joined by the Right Honourable Alistair Burns, who's been sitting at the back listening and is keen to give just 5 minutes talk before we finish this session. So we will cut the questioning short in a while, but there is about 15 minutes of questioning available. So who's first? Alistair.
What are your biggest errors? It's a very good question. We made a few errors on the way, mainly around initially thinking that people, so there's this really nice decision-making theory that it's sort of like this new classic Newtonian decision-making theory. If you put the right information in front of the right people at the right time to make the right decision, it doesn't work. Right? So you need to actually think about how you can build the narrative in such a way people engage with it. So after the first two workshops, we had the vision talked about, and we had it all set up. We tried to communicate it in more traditional forms using graphics and paper and stuff. It just didn't work. So then we thought about how do we scale it. It didn't work a number of ways, one of which was the scale. Really wanted to try and capture some of the complexity and the intricacies of that vision being developed. And that's when we developed Showcase. So along the way, there's been a few missteps at the early stages, but each one of those has led to something which has actually been a much more well thought out solution. But like I said earlier, there is no straight line path to making this work. There's no perfect line, and you will make errors and iterations on the way, and you look back and you think, what were we doing? But what you should get as a result of that is a much better next step.
Caroline. Do you want
I'm Caroline Sutherland. I'm the board patient representative for Harts Valley's Clinical Commissioning Group. When you look at the plan at the beginning, there's one thing we've said, but one pot of money. How did you determine the difference between patients' needs and wants? In other words, the general population always wants something, but they don't seem to realise that the need is greater than the want, and the finance is what governs it. So how did you put that across to the population?
So I think that the driver behind what patients want is good quality care that doesn't end up being bounced around the system, and with people that understand that the care is joined up, that it's a unified view, and that they will get the best care every time. So what I mean by that is often at the start of this we sat down with patient reps and patient groups, and so also we had no control of who came through Showcase, and patient groups came through Showcase and gave us feedback as well. And what they said was that they were sick of going to see their care provider and then being referred to somebody else and somebody else and somebody else, and each time telling the same story. I'm in here because of this, and spending literally hours retelling a story every single time. And one of their biggest requests was, we just want someone to know what's going on and direct us to the appropriate care at the appropriate time, rather than just bouncing around the system. And so I think that's one of the driving needs, and when you take a design-centered approach to that, you come up with all sorts of different outcomes. So one of the outcomes so far has been that Canterbury's developed in conjunction with a healthcare software provider a unified health record that goes across the system. So in contrast to many failed attempts around the world, you can now go into Canterbury, the different providers who can all access one patient record, and you can all see the same view of the same record, which means that you're not retelling the story every single time. And I think from what we saw was that what patients demanded was a much more compassionate, joined up view of the system that gave them the right care rather than just being bounced around like pinballs through the system.
So can I just add to that? So how did you get round the situation at the beginning when the answer was, let's build a new hospital? Because obviously your finance wasn't able to cope with the new hospital. And what you saw as an organisation didn't make it feasible because there was another answer. Now, that is what I would say, patients wanting something that wasn't possible. How did you get around that?
So we took time to explain that actually hospitals aren't necessarily the best place for patients to be. So that also that care is better provided in the community, and that keeping patients out of hospital was one of the goals that we had, and leaving hospital resources for those that actually needed it when they actually needed it, as opposed to just bouncing into ED when you can't afford to go see a GP, for example. So I think there's a process of education that's gone through this, and there is a patient sort of council that's been heavily involved in having their input into this system and this transformation journey. Because without patients in there as well, then you're sort of like bouncing against unknown quantity. So bringing patients and decision-making process is really important. There's a patient council being involved in this process as well.
Thank you very much.
Steve Later at the far end, and then Dr. Shakur after that.
Thank you very much, Roger. Just a quick further question on patient need. Most health systems tend to find that about the top 5% of the population consume 50% or more of the cost of the system. Could you just talk a little bit more about your segmentation approach and how you focused on the groups in society that would most benefit from an integrated approach?
I'm not the best person to answer that around segmentation. I'm not a clinician, and there are people that will give a much better answer to that, so I wouldn't want to give you the wrong information now. My expertise is around how you do the alignment and the large-scale change, so I couldn't give you a good answer to that, sorry.
Sorry. One of the issues which we face as a clinician, I'm a GP, one of the things which we face in our service is that the fear of risk and litigations and things like that, and your approach of tolerating risk. Say, if I miss a case of small melanoma or something like that, how do your system protect GPs from being sued for this missing a melanoma or something of that nature? And is there any direct communication, Skyping or dermatology service which looks at these things by the consultant and say this needs to go this way or that way? Have you faced that situation at all?
So once again, I'm not a clinician, so I can't give you an exact answer to that, but by tolerating risk, what I mean is that you need to have a tolerance for risk for understanding how transformation needs to happen, and then within that you're going to have care pathways that change according to best practice, and the care pathways will change according to what the clinicians decide is the best care pathway. But the risk is around essentially understanding that you need to make change, the system's in crisis, so the risk is around not doing something versus actually saying we're going to actually make a step change to try and change the outcomes for patients, right? So the tolerance of risk is actually building up trust with your system and then taking an approach which is quite different to how people normally approach change, but was known to work.
So just by the GP following the pathway, in a sense, the pathway will protect the GP.
Yes.
Because he's following that pathway.
Yeah, so the pathway is best care, designed by clinicians.
So the next question from Dr. Schindler.
Jeremy Schindler, I'm a GP. I was trying to relate some of your experience to where I think we're at now, and I was wondering about how you worked within what must have been an existing contracting framework that was trying to struggle on at the time whilst you were managing change. And I guess particularly within that, how did you manage the immediate financial silos and constraints? How did you correlate that with the vision that you were trying to get to?
What was developed was an approach around what's called alliance contracting. So rather than saying, so there was a transition period, and the person that would give the best answer to that is like a lady who did the planning and funding process. But essentially it transitioned from an approach where there was a contract to hit a certain number of outputs over a certain period of time, and then the challenge was if you hit outputs plus one, what happened? Right, people fell in the cracks. To moving towards an alliance framework, people work together to actually have outcomes rather than delivered outputs. And so an alliance process for bringing people together and working in that method is now how healthcare is delivered in Canterbury. People working together rather than working to the contractual output based on how many numbers you put through. That's a whole 2 hours of talking about how that would work. And once again, I'm not the best person to talk about that, but the broad framework is around alliance.
I think we get time for just one more question before I introduce.
Hi, I'm a foreigner from up north, with similar sort of issues you're addressing here. I was fascinated by your description of engagement and how you engage with senior managers and then roll out. And against that diagram you have there, I think one of the key messages I've got from you is involving people and empowering people. And I think my question is it all on one footprint or are there different footprints? And,
What do you mean by footprint?
well, you've got a diagram there, and so does everything happen across the whole of the health board, or is there engagement and are services organised at community levels, at neighbourhood levels?
Yes,
Because that's where we're going in England, I think.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to draw some parallels.
So the challenge that we had initially was that if you wanted to include thought leaders and influencers in the cross system, then there are literally hundreds, if not thousands, of organisations of varying sizes you need to engage with. So one of our challenges was, who are the top 20 organisations with the scale and the budget and the resources that can start to move the dial? Because you go all the way down, you've got community mental health providers, you've got pharmacists, you've got podiatrists, whatever, it goes all the way down. So there's a certain level at which you basically have to start trusting you've created enough momentum around change and word of mouth that it starts to filter through the system. But at the outset, engaging with the top providers is the key part. So you can't go to everybody of every organisation, but you have to start somewhere. Or a similar sort of system, lots and lots of little providers as well as a handful of larger ones. I think that's where I have to wrap up. So,
Good, thank you. I know
Thank you
you're
very
going to be
much.
around over the lunch period and coffee break, which is shortly coming up. So thank you again. So we'll